The rain in Kandari Station fell sideways that morning, hammering against the reinforced shutters of Bay 7 like it had a grudge to settle. Inside, the noise was almost peaceful by comparison. The low hum of climate regulators, the click of tools being set down on a metal tray, the occasional scrape of a boot against concrete. Dr. Elena Vasquez didn't look up from the diagnostic panel in front of her. 31 years old, hair tied back in a knot that had long since stopped looking neat, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. She was elbow deep in the guts of an old atmospheric processor, coaxing a stubborn coolant valve back into alignment with the kind of patient, unglamorous competence that never made it into recruitment posters. "Come on," she muttered, more to the valve than to anyone listening. "You've done this 100 times. The valve clicked into place. She exhaled, wiped her hands on a rag that had given up on being white sometime last year, and reached for her thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. This was her life. Not glory, not headlines. Maintenance shifts, routine diagnostics, the occasional argument with a supply officer about back-ordered filters. She liked it that way. She had been a field medic once, in a war most people her age barely remembered anymore. Fought in mud and heat on a continent that didn't matter to the history books outside her own country. She didn't talk about it much. She'd traded a rifle and a trauma kit for a tool belt and a maintenance manifest, and she'd never once regretted the trade. There was a rhythm to this life that she'd come to love in a quiet, unglamorous way. Wake before the alarm. Check the manifest. Walk the same 3 corridors past the same tired jokes from the same handful of coworkers who'd become something like family over the years. Fix what was broken. Log it. Repeat. It wasn't the kind of life anyone wrote songs about, and that suited her fine. She'd had enough of songs written about her line of work. The quiet ones were always truer than the loud ones in her experience. The loud ones were for people who hadn't done the job, only heard about it afterward. On the wall of her small maintenance office back on Kandari Station, tucked between a shift schedule and a coffee-stained calendar nobody had bothered updating past March, hung an old worn shotgun that had belonged to her grandfather. A farmer, not a soldier, who'd kept it by his door his whole life without ever once needing to use it on anything more dangerous than a fox in the henhouse. She kept it the same way. Not because she expected trouble, because a species that survived as long as hers had learned that readiness and paranoia were different things entirely, and only one of them was worth keeping around. The station's calm crackled to life above her head, the mundane tone of a routine check-in. "Vasquez, you copy? We've got an unscheduled contact on long range. Command wants eyes on it before we escalate." She sighed, capped her thermos, and reached for the comm unit clipped to her collar. "Copy. What kind of contact?" There was a pause. Not a good pause. The kind of pause that told her the person on the other end didn't quite believe what they were reading off their own screen. "Ma'am, it's not one of ours, and it's not moving like debris." Elena set down her rag. Outside, the rain kept falling, indifferent to the fact that in less than 6 hours the quiet, unremarkable life of Kandari Station, and the quiet, unremarkable life of humanity itself, was about to end. 11 light-years away, in a control chamber built from curved obsidian black alloy and lit by the soft blue glow of 1,000 data threads, Fleet Commander Exar Velthessa allowed himself the small luxury of a smile. He was Threll, tall, angular, built for the cold gravity of a world humans had never seen and would never pronounce the name of correctly. His people had been moving through the stars for 11,000 years, longer than humanity had known how to smelt iron. He did not smile often. Smiling among the Threll was reserved for moments of quiet, earned confidence. This was one of them. "Run it again," he said, and his adjutant, a younger officer named Nar Osek, obliged without complaint, tapping the projection back to life above the central table. The report hovered there, translated into crisp Threll script, stamped with the seal of the Outer Reach Survey Division. It had taken 3 scout ships and 2 years to compile. Exar had read it 4 times already. He didn't need a 5th. But there was something satisfying about watching the data confirm itself, over and over, like a held note resolving cleanly into harmony. Species designation, human Terran homeworld threat. Assessment, Minimal physical resilience, low pain, tolerance, low. Subjects display rapid incapacitation under standard stress testing, military capacity, fragmented, pre-unification, no standing interstellar force recommendation, suitable for controlled first contact, resource assessment protocol. Fragmented, Exar said, turning the word over like a stone in his palm. No standing force, and this, he gestured at the pain tolerance line. This is the part that matters, Nar. A species that breaks easily under controlled stress is a species that negotiates quickly. No prolonged conflict, no costly siege. We arrive, we demonstrate capability, they capitulate, and the resource treaty writes itself within a season. Nar Osek said nothing. He was young for his rank, barely 2 centuries into a career that would, with luck, span 12 more. He had a habit, one his superiors found either endearing or irritating depending on their mood, of asking questions before he was told to stop. "Commander," he said carefully, "the scout data. It was gathered from testing on isolated individuals, not organized defense units. Is it possible that a species with no space program, no unified government, and a pain threshold that collapses under a standard neural stress simulator poses a meaningful threat to a Threll expeditionary fleet?" Exar's tone wasn't unkind. It was simply certain, the way a man is certain the sun will rise. "No, Nar, it is not possible. I have seen this pattern 11 times in my career. Species reach the stars in one of 2 ways: together, as a unified whole, or alone, fractured and desperate. The humans are the second kind. Desperate species do not fight well. They fight hard sometimes, but not well. There is a difference, and it is the only difference that matters." He straightened, folding his hands behind his back, looking every part the commander who had done this before and would do it again. "We are not here to conquer, Nar. We are here to demonstrate a show of restraint, a controlled test of resilience, and a treaty signed in humility rather than blood. That is the mercy of overwhelming strength. You rarely have to use it." Behind him, unnoticed, the projection flickered for half a second. A single line of metadata scrolling past too fast to catch, appended by the survey ship's junior analyst months ago, and never escalated because no one thought it mattered. Note: Subject test group consisted of unconscious, anesthetized civilian volunteers under controlled hospital conditions. Combat-relevant pain response not independently verified. Recommend follow-up assessment. No one read the footnote. Footnotes rarely change the momentum of an empire already moving. The Outer Reach Survey Division had a reputation, among the wider Threll authority, for thoroughness bordering on obsession. Their reports were dense, cross-referenced, peer-reviewed by committees who took pride in finding fault with each other's work. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most reliable intelligence apparatuses in known space, which was precisely why nobody thought to question it here. A reputation for accuracy is its own kind of blind spot. The better an institution has been at being right, the less anyone expects it to be catastrophically, foundationally wrong about something as basic as its opening assumption. And wait, if you reach this part of story, then please like and subscribe. That means a lot to us. Exar had built his entire career on trusting that reputation. 11 contacts, 11 successful outcomes, each one beginning with a survey report not unlike this one, each one ending in a treaty signed by a species that had, in one way or another, recognized the futility of resistance early and spared everyone the unpleasantness of finding out the hard way. He saw no reason this 12th contact would differ from the pattern. Patterns, in his experience, were the closest thing the universe offered to promises. Exar turned to the tactical display where a single modest human vessel, a research and supply escort according to the file, unarmed, unremarkable, blinked quietly in the dark between the stars. "Bring us within hailing range," he said. "Let's go meet our new neighbors." The Meridian Grace was not built to fight. Everyone aboard her knew that, from the captain down to the newest deckhand still learning which corridor led to the mess hall. She was a research and resupply vessel, ferrying scientific equipment and a skeleton crew of 11 to Kandari Station, running the kind of quiet, uneventful route that made spacers yawn instead of pray before departure. Elena Vasquez was aboard her, along with the same coffee thermos and the same rolled-up sleeves because the station's atmospheric processor parts had finally been approved for shipment, and someone with hands-on experience needed to escort them. She was in the galley, halfway through a joke with the ship's engineer about the station's chronically malfunctioning coffee machine, when the alarms began. Not the shrill, cinematic wail people imagined, just 3 low tones, evenly spaced, repeating. Unidentified contact. Unidentified contact. Unidentified contact. The captain's voice came over the intercom a moment later, flat and controlled in the way trained people sound when they're refusing to let panic into their voice. All hands. Secure stations. We have company, and it's not one of ours. Elena set her mug down without spilling a drop. Old habits. On the bridge, the view screen resolved the newcomer out of the dark. A vessel 3 times the Grace's length, its hull a smooth, matte black that seemed to drink the starlight around it rather than reflect it. No weapons were visible. None needed to be. Something about its shape communicated purpose the way a blade communicates purpose even sheathed. They're hailing us, the comms officer said, voice tight. Put it through. Threll Thessa's projected image filled the bridge's central display. Tall, composed, radiating the calm authority of someone who had done this before, on a dozen other worlds. He inclined his head in a gesture the Grace's captain, a weathered woman named Aris Kovalenko, recognized immediately as diplomatic theater. Greetings, vessel of Terra, Exar said, his translated voice smooth and unhurried. I am Fleet Commander Threll Thessa of the Threll Expeditionary Authority. We come in the spirit of contact, not conquest. We ask only that you power down non-essential systems and prepare to be boarded for a standard assessment protocol. Resist, and we will be forced to demonstrate why resistance is unwise. Kovalenko glanced sideways, once at the tactical officer, who gave the smallest shake of his head. No weapons capable of matching that. She looked back at the screen and kept her voice level. Commander, this is an unarmed research vessel. We're happy to talk, but I want to be clear. You're not boarding my ship. Exar's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. The faint recalibration of a man readjusting his estimate of a variable he'd already decided didn't matter. Admirable, he said, and there was something almost fond in it, the tone of a teacher watching a student make a predictable, forgivable mistake. But unnecessary. We are aware of your species' physiological limits, Captain. We do not intend harm. We intend a demonstration, brief, controlled, and reversible. Once complete, negotiations may proceed as equals. And if we say no, then the demonstration becomes involuntary, Exar said, still gently, still certain. I would prefer it not come to that, for your sake. The channel closed. On the bridge, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Elena Vasquez, who had come up from the galley and was standing quietly near the back of the room because nobody had told her not to, said the only thing that came to mind. He thinks this is going to be easy. Kovalenko looked at her. You've read the same intelligence reports the rest of us have. Maybe it will be. Elena didn't answer right away. She was thinking about a hospital ward 11 years and 1 war ago, about soldiers who'd walked 3 miles on a shattered ankle because stopping wasn't an option, about the particular, specific stubbornness of a species that had spent 100,000 years refusing to lie down and die quietly. No, she said finally. I don't think it will. The boarding team arrived 40 minutes later, 6 Threll soldiers in matte black exo armor, moving through the Grace's corridors with the unhurried confidence of an occupying force that expected no resistance, and, more importantly, expected the resistance it did encounter to fold quickly. They brought with them a device. It was compact, almost elegant, a silver housing about the size of a suitcase, with a single articulated arm and a smooth, curved interface pad. The Threll called it a threshold unit. It had been used, according to the survey report Exar had read 4 times, on 11 other pre-contact species, and in every case, it had done exactly what it was designed to do. apply a calibrated, escalating neural stress signal to a restrained subject, and record precisely how much resistance would be required before that species broke, surrendered, or lost consciousness. The report on humans had said, low tolerance, rapid incapacitation. The soldiers set the device up in the Grace's cargo bay with clinical efficiency, restraining Kovalenko in the calibration chair. Protocol dictated the ship's ranking officer be the subject, both as a show of the crew's collective stake in the outcome and, XR suspected, as a piece of theater. Break the captain, and the crew breaks with her. Elena stood near the back of the cargo bay, arms crossed, saying nothing. Watching the Threll technician, a smaller, quieter soldier who handled the device with the bored precision of someone who had done this 11 times before and expected a 12th, uneventful result. XR himself observed from the doorway, hands folded behind his back, the picture of restrained ceremony. This will be brief, he said to the room in general. The unit will apply a calibrated neural stimulus. Standard protocol suggests submission within the first 3 intervals. Once complete, we may proceed to more productive discussions. The technician activated the unit. The first interval hit Kovalenko like a hot wire dragged along every nerve in her body at once. She gasped, jaw clenched, knuckles white on the arms of the chair. And then, breathing hard through her nose, she looked directly at the projection of XR's calm, expectant face and said, with more venom than volume, "Is that it?" The technician frowned at his readout. Recalibrated. Increased output. The second interval came. Kovalenko's back arched against the restraints. A vein stood out at her temple. She made a sound through gritted teeth that wasn't quite a scream, more a long, furious exhale. And then, when it ended, she spat, onto the cargo bay floor and said, "My grandmother's contractions hurt worse than that. It wasn't bravado." Elena, watching from the back of the room, knew that much. She'd seen real bravado before, the kind that cracked the moment the cameras turned off. This wasn't that. This was something closer to genuine, baffled disappointment. The specific expression of a person who had braced for something and found it, frankly, underwhelming. The technician's readout was no longer showing the smooth, predictable escalation curve his species' medical science had documented across 11 prior contacts. It was showing something the device's calibration protocols had no category for, a subject whose baseline resistance exceeded the projected failure threshold of the entire test range. He looked up at XR. For the first time since the boarding began, there was uncertainty in the technician's posture. "Commander," he said, "the unit is reading anomalous. This subject has absorbed input beyond increased to maximum," XR said. And though his voice hadn't changed, something behind his eyes had. The first flicker of a man watching his own certainty develop a crack. The technician hesitated only a second before obeying. Maximum output, a setting that on every previous species tested had never once been necessary, because every previous species had broken long before reaching it. The third interval hit. And the threshold unit, the silver, elegant, 11 times proven device, made a sound none of the Threll soldiers had ever heard it make before. A high, straining whine, deep in its housing, followed by a sharp electrical crack and a thin curl of smoke rising from its casing. The screen went dark. Kovalenko, chest heaving, restraints still locked around her wrists, lifted her head and looked at the smoking device with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and grim satisfaction. "Guess it couldn't take a joke," she rasped. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the cargo bay moved. The Threll technician stared at the dead machine like it had personally betrayed him. The 5 soldiers behind XR exchanged glances that, translated from body language into words, would have amounted to something like "what?" and Exar Velthessa, fleet commander. 11 successful first contacts, a career built on the quiet mathematics of overwhelming, unshakable certainty, stood in the doorway of a cargo bay on an unarmed research vessel, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the specific vertigo of watching a foundational premise collapse in real time. The machine had broken. Not the human. Somewhere behind him, Nar Osek, who had asked the question nobody wanted to hear back on the flagship, said nothing at all. He didn't need to. His silence had become, in the space of about 11 seconds, the loudest thing in the room. They released Kovalenko from the chair without being asked. Nobody gave the order. The soldiers simply did it. The way people instinctively step back from something they no longer understand. Elena Vasquez crossed the cargo bay before anyone stopped her, checking Kovalenko's pulse with 2 fingers against her throat out of pure medic's habit, murmuring something low and steady that only the captain could hear. Kovalenko waved her off after a moment. I'm fine. And it was remarkably mostly true. Shaken, sweating, furious. But standing, XR had gone quiet. Not defeated. A career built across 11 successful contacts didn't collapse in a single afternoon, but recalibrating, visibly, the way a man does when the ground has shifted slightly beneath a structure he'd trusted his whole weight to. Commander, Elena said, straightening up, addressing him directly for the first time. Her voice wasn't hostile. That was, in its own way, more unsettling than if it had been. You look like a man who just found out his map was drawn by someone who never left the house. XR studied her. Not the captain, not the injured party. This one, quiet, unarmed, standing at the back of the room the whole time, who apparently felt entitled to speak to a fleet commander as though they were equals. You have something to say, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I do. Elena glanced at the smoking wreckage of the threshold unit, then back at him. Sit down, Commander. I'll explain what just happened to your machine, and it'll save you a lot of trouble on the next 10 worlds you visit. There was a long pause. Then, to the visible astonishment of his own soldiers, XR Velthessa sat. Elena pulled a crate over and sat across from him, elbows on her knees, the posture of someone who had delivered hard news to frightened people more times than she could count and had learned somewhere along the way that calm was more persuasive than volume ever was. Your report, she said, was built on data from anesthetized hospital patients, unconscious people who were never resisting anything because they weren't awake to resist. That's not a measurement of human pain tolerance. That's a measurement of sedation. You tested how much stimulus it takes to disturb someone who's already been told, medically, that it's safe to stop paying attention. And then you pointed a machine calibrated for that number at a woman who was wide awake, furious, and had absolutely no intention of giving you the satisfaction. XR said nothing. Nar Osek, standing just behind him, had gone very still. Here's the thing you need to understand about us, Commander, Elena continued. It's not that we don't feel pain. We feel it. We feel it a lot, honestly. Worse than most species you've probably surveyed, if the readouts on your dead machine are anything to go by. What's different is what we do with it. She held up a hand, counting off. Not dramatically, just methodically, the way she might list ingredients in a recipe. 80,000 years ago, give or take, our ancestors were running down prey animals on the open plains. Not by being faster than them, because we're slow, embarrassingly slow, but by chasing them for hours, sometimes days, through heat that should have killed us, until the animal which was faster simply gave out first. We didn't win by being stronger. We won by being the species that refuses to stop. 200 years ago, she went on, we fought wars that killed tens of millions of our own people. And instead of that breaking us into smaller, weaker pieces the way it might have broken another species, it built the largest, most stable cooperative structures in our history. We build our strongest alliances directly out of our worst pain. That's not an accident, Commander. That's the operating system. 11 years ago, she said, quieter now, I was a medic. I watched a 19-year-old soldier walk 3 miles on a fractured ankle because stopping meant his unit didn't make the extraction point in time. He wasn't tolerating pain, Commander. He'd made a decision that the mission mattered more than the pain did. And once that decision was made, the pain simply became information, data he was aware of, but no longer negotiating with. She let that sit for a moment. Your machine, she said, was built to measure how much stimulus it takes before a subject decides that stopping is the rational choice. On every species you've tested it on, that number exists. It's real. It's just, Commander, on us, that number isn't a number. It's a decision, made individually, by every person your machine has ever been pointed at. And that decision has almost nothing to do with the amount of pain involved, and almost everything to do with what that person has decided the pain is for. Elena leaned forward slightly. Captain Kovalenko decided, somewhere around interval 2, that she'd be damned if she gave a stranger's diagnostic machine the satisfaction of a scream. That's not resilience your instruments can calibrate for, because it's not a biological ceiling. It's a choice, and choices don't max out a dial. For a long moment, the cargo bay was silent except for the soft ticking of the dead threshold unit cooling in its housing. Then Exar spoke, and for the first time since his arrival, his voice had lost its polish. Your report. How many humans has your species subjected to this? Deliberate, voluntary suffering for the sake of something larger than themselves? Elena considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. I don't have an exact number, Commander. I'd guess it's in the billions, across our whole history. We don't always do it well. We don't always do it for good reasons. But we've had a very, very long time to practice deciding that pain isn't the end of the conversation. It's usually just the opening line. She paused, then added more gently, because something in his expression had shifted from certainty to something closer to genuine unease. I'm not telling you this to threaten you, Commander. I'm telling you because I think you came here expecting a demonstration of strength, and I think it would be a kindness to explain clearly exactly what you almost demonstrated instead. Exar's jaw tightened. He looked for a long moment at the smoking ruin of a machine that had worked flawlessly on 11 other worlds. Then he looked at Kovalenko, still shaking slightly with adrenaline, refusing to sit down. Then last, at Elena, who was watching him with something that wasn't triumph. It was closer, disturbingly, to sympathy. Show him, Kovalenko said suddenly, her voice still rough. Show him the archive footage. Let him see what happens when we stop deciding to be reasonable about it. Elena hesitated, glancing at the captain, then nodded slowly. She pulled a data slate from her jacket. Standard equipment, nothing military, the kind of device any civilian might carry, and keyed up a short, unclassified clip that every schoolchild on Earth had seen at some point in a history lesson. Grainy footage, a detonation, decades old, a column of light and fire climbing into a desert sky, a shockwave flattening structures for miles in every direction. That, Elena said quietly, was us deciding, collectively as an entire species, that we were willing to end civilization to avoid losing a specific argument. We didn't do it, not because we couldn't, because at the last possible moment, enough of us decided the argument wasn't worth it. That decision, Commander, the one where we don't use everything we're capable of, that's the only thing standing between minimal threat and something your survey division genuinely does not have a category for. The clip ended. The cargo bay was utterly silent. We are not a threat because we want to hurt you, Elena said, switching off the slate. We are dangerous because we are extremely, historically good at deciding to keep going in any direction we choose, and your intelligence report never once asked what direction we might decide to go in, if provoked instead of respected. Exar Velthessa, fleet commander of 11 successful first contacts, sat in the wreckage of his own certainty and said nothing at all for a long, long moment. Nar Osek did not sleep that night. Ship cycle time. Though the flagship's quarters were as comfortable as any he'd known in his career. He lay in the dark, replaying the cargo bay over and over. The smoking threshold unit, the human captain's raw, exhausted defiance, the strange and unfamiliar quiet on his commander's face. He had asked a question back when this had all still been theoretical. Is it possible the data is incomplete? He had asked it the way young officers were trained to ask difficult questions. Carefully, deferentially, prepared to be told he was wrong. He had not expected to be right. He certainly hadn't expected to be this right. The Threll boarding party had withdrawn without incident. No shots fired, no further escalation. Just a fleet commander who had requested, quietly, almost humbly, a follow-up conversation with the human captain and her medic, this time as something closer to equals than his opening transmission had implied. Nar had stayed in the cargo bay a few minutes longer than protocol required, ostensibly to help recover the ruined equipment. In truth, He had wanted to look at the human, Elena, a little longer. Not out of suspicion. Out of something closer to the specific vertigo of watching a wall you'd been told was load-bearing turn out to be made of paper, and the structure above it not collapsing but somehow standing taller for the revelation. She had caught him staring at one point, and instead of the wary hostility he'd braced for, she had simply asked, "You're the one who flagged the data as incomplete, aren't you?" He'd been startled enough to answer honestly. "How did you know?" "You're the only one in the room who looked disappointed instead of shocked when the machine broke," she'd said. "Disappointed people are usually the ones who already suspected." He hadn't known what to say to that. He still didn't, hours later, lying awake in the dark. What unsettled him most wasn't the failure of the threshold unit, or even the footage of the ancient human weapon test Elena had shown them. It was smaller than that, and stranger. It was the memory of watching Captain Kovalenko, restrained and in genuine pain, look directly at his commander's projected image and choose deliberately, in the moment of greatest vulnerability, to insult the machine rather than beg it to stop. Every species Nar had ever surveyed measured strength in what a body could withstand. The humans, it seemed, measured it in what a mind refused to concede. That was a category his people's entire framework for assessing threats had never accounted for, because it didn't show up on any biological scan. It only showed up in the choosing. He thought of his own people's history. Proud, disciplined, built on hierarchy and clean chains of command, on the comforting certainty that a well-run structure would always outlast an undisciplined one. He had believed that, genuinely, his whole career. He still believed most of it. But he found himself thinking, for the first time, about what it might mean to encounter a species that didn't need the structure to hold, because each individual inside it had already decided, on their own without being ordered to, exactly how far they were willing to go. That's not a weaker foundation, he thought, staring at the dark ceiling of his quarters. That might be a stronger one. It just doesn't look like ours. He didn't share this thought with Exar that night. It wasn't the kind of thought that fit neatly into a report, and Nar had learned over 2 centuries that some realizations needed to sit quietly for a while before they were ready to become policy. But he made a note, a small private one, appended to nothing official, that he intended to revisit for the rest of his career. Recommend all future first contact protocols include direct, conscious, voluntary interviews. Do not extrapolate resolve from unconscious data. A species that chooses its limits cannot be measured by instruments built to find where a body simply stops. It was the first entry in what would, decades later, become known across 3 sectors of Threll space as the OSSEC doctrine, the founding document of an entirely new discipline of first contact protocol, built on a single hard-won principle. Ask them what they're willing to endure, and believe the answer, because they will always, eventually, prove it true. 6 months later, the treaty between Earth and the Threll Expeditionary Authority was signed not aboard a flagship, but in a modest conference room on Kandari Station, over cups of coffee that Exar Velthessa had by then developed a genuine and slightly embarrassing fondness for. The terms were fair: trade routes, shared research access, mutual non-interference clauses that neither side ever seriously tested, because neither side particularly wanted to find out what testing them would cost. Captain Kovalenko retired eventually, her name attached, Gnyest without her permission, much to her irritation, to a training module now taught in 3 separate academies across 2 species, informally nicknamed among Threll cadets as the Kovalenko Standard. Never assume a subject's silence means acceptance, and never mistake a person's refusal to scream for an absence of pain. Elena Vasquez went back to fixing atmospheric processors. She never gave another lecture like the one in that cargo bay, not because she didn't have more to say, but because, as she put it once to a journalist who tracked her down years later, "I only had to say it once. They were good listeners in the end, better than I expected." 4 years later, the Threll Survey Division underwent a quiet, sweeping reform, buried deep in procedural language that nonetheless represented one of the largest doctrinal shifts in the authority's 11,000-year history. The threshold unit, the device that had, for 11 prior contacts, worked exactly as designed, was formally decommissioned across the fleet. In its place, mandatory conscious subject interviews, voluntary demonstration protocols, and a new classification tier that hadn't existed before humanity forced it into being. Nar Osek, by then a division head himself, insisted the tier apply retroactively to every species previously surveyed. Most had never needed it. Humanity was, for the first several years, the only entry. 15 years later, human vessels, small, still relatively unimpressive by Threll engineering standards, but numerous, stubborn, and unfailingly, courteously direct, had become a familiar sight along 3 major trade corridors. Threll merchants had picked up the habit, entirely without official sanction, of nodding respectfully to any human crew they passed, a small gesture that had started as a joke among dock workers and calcified, over the years, into something closer to genuine custom. A phrase entered Threll vernacular during this period, translated roughly and imperfectly as, "Don't make the human decide." It was used by then about everything from bar disputes to trade negotiations, a shorthand for a simple hard-earned piece of wisdom, that the danger in a human was never in what they could be forced to endure, but in what they might, of their own free will, choose to endure on your behalf or against you, depending entirely on how you treated them first. 30 years later, Exarvel Thessa, long retired from active command, kept a small, unremarkable object on the shelf of his quarters, a fused, blackened fragment of silver housing, all that remained of the original threshold unit after the Meridian Grace incident. Visitors who asked about it received, depending on his mood, either a long and detailed retelling of the story, or a short, quiet answer. It taught me more in 11 seconds than 11 successful campaigns ever did. He kept in occasional contact with Elena Vasquez, now an old woman herself, still living near Kandari Station, still, by her own cheerful insistence, entirely unremarkable. Their correspondence was brief, infrequent, and, in its own understated way, one of the most important diplomatic relationships neither government had ever formally acknowledged. On Earth, in a small maintenance office not far from where this story began, a framed photograph hung on the wall beside a shotgun that had belonged to Elena's grandfather. Not because anyone expected to need it, not anymore, not after everything, but because a species that had learned across 80,000 years and 100 wars that the wisest kind of strength was the kind you kept ready but rarely had to use, wasn't about to unlearn that lesson simply because the stars had turned out to be friendlier than expected. Beneath the photograph, a candid shot of Elena, Kovalenko, and, unexpectedly, a grinning Nar Osek, taken during a diplomatic visit years after the incident. Someone had added a small brass plaque, half joke and half genuine tribute, that read simply, "They tested our pain tolerance." The machine broke first, and somewhere among the stars, on 1,000 worlds that had once read a file marked "minimal threat" and believed it without question, a new file had quietly begun circulating instead, shorter, simpler, and, unlike the one it replaced, entirely permanently true. Species, human. Threat assessment. Depends entirely on how you treat them. Recommendation, be kind. They will remember, either way. And for the first time, the galaxy understood what it truly meant to be human. If this story moved you, subscribe for more human stories from the stars.